Nana knows best. Chapter 1. The Casserole that started a war. I should have known something was off the moment I walked into Nana Edith's kitchen, and found her glaring at my phone like it had personally insulted her late husband, Grandpa Roy. "What?" she said, pointing a wooden spoon at the screen. "Is that thing telling you to do now?" I looked down. I'd been using a smart recipe app. One of those AI-powered ones that adjusts measurements in real time, suggests substitutions, and plays ambient kitchen music if your stress levels seem elevated. Which, I was about to find out, they very much were. "It's just a recipe app, Nana. I'm trying to learn how to cook." She made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a foghorn blast. A recipe app. Right. And does the recipe app know that you need to smell the onions before you decide whether to caramelize them or just soften them? Does the recipe app know that the butter has to be the good butter, not that watery nonsense from the supermarket? And that you have to add it when the pan is happy, not when the timer says to? I opened my mouth. I closed it again. I was 26 years old. I had a decent job in marketing. I had remembered to water my houseplants for nearly 3 consecutive months. And yet, standing in my grandmother's kitchen in rural Yorkshire. She'd moved there from Birmingham after Grandpa died, saying she needed proper air. I felt approximately 7 years old and deeply underqualified for life. "The pan," I said carefully, "is happy. You'll know," she said, turning back to her stove. "Now sit down. I'm going to make the casserole." The casserole. Capital T, capital C. The thing that had, at various points in my life, cured what felt like the flu, consoled me through a terrible breakup, appeared at every Christmas and Easter without fail, and reportedly once caused my Uncle Derek to weep openly at the dinner table. Nana Edith's Lancashire hot pot adjacent, slow-cooked, falling apart, rich as sin casserole. The recipe for which she had never, not once, written down or shared with a single living soul. I'd come to Yorkshire for the weekend specifically to ask for it. Not just ask. Beg, if necessary. I was hosting my first proper dinner party in 3 weeks, a grown-up affair with cloth napkins and everything, and I had decided that Nana's casserole was the thing I wanted to serve. It was, I told myself optimistically, a foolproof plan. Nana, of course, had not agreed to anything yet. She cooked in silence for a while, and I sat at the big pine table. The one with the burn mark from when Uncle Derek was 12 and thought a hot casserole dish could just live on wood forever. And watched her. She moved around the kitchen the way she always had. Unhurried, purposeful, adding things from unlabeled jars with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. A pinch of this. A glug of that. A long pause during which she just stood over the pot and smelled it. "Nana," I tried. "I was thinking. If you just told me what goes in it, or let me film you making it, no. I could take notes, or, no. Or I could get one of those transcription apps that." She turned around and fixed me with the look. The look was a family legend. My mum said it could stop a clock. My Uncle Derek said it once made his car refuse to start. I said nothing else. "If you want the recipe," Nana Edith said, stirring slowly, "you'll have to earn it." "Earn it how?" She smiled, which was somehow worse than the look. "You cook it for me. Without." She nodded at my phone. "Any of that. No apps. No timers. No little voice telling you what to do. You use your hands, your nose, your eyes. You cook it the way I cook it. And if it's right." She paused, tasting from the spoon. "I'll write it all down. Every last bit." I stared at her. "And if it's not right? Then you come back and try again." She turned back to the stove, satisfied. "I'm not going anywhere. I've got nowhere better to be." This was, I suspected, Not entirely true. She had a full social calendar involving the Women's Institute, a surprisingly competitive local quiz league, and a book club that seemed to mostly drink wine. But arguing the point felt unwise. Fine, I said. When? Next Saturday, she said. Give yourself the week to practice. And put that phone away at the table. It's rude. Chapter 2. A week of culinary catastrophes. By Tuesday, I had ruined 4 onions, singed a tea towel, and had a very illuminating conversation with my neighbor Marcus through the kitchen wall. Mostly consisting of him shouting, "Are you all right in there?" and me shouting back something unconvincing about steam. The thing was, I could cook. Sort of. I could follow a recipe. I could operate a hob without setting off the smoke alarm more than twice. I made a very passable pasta arrabbiata, and I had once produced a birthday cake that, while lopsided, was structurally sound and tasted fine. But cooking without any digital assistance turned out to be a fundamentally different experience from cooking with it. It wasn't just the timers, though I missed those desperately. It was the absence of the guiding voice, the step-by-step structure, the reassuring little chime when something was done. Without the app, cooking felt less like following instructions and more like improvising jazz. And I, it turned out, had the musical instincts of a confused spaniel. Wednesday was particularly grim. I'd bought a shoulder of lamb. The right cut, I was fairly certain. And decided to practice slow cooking it with vegetables and stock. Simple enough. Except that I got distracted by a work email about 40 minutes in. Came back to find the oven at entirely the wrong temperature. And ended up with something that was technically edible but tasted primarily of regret. I called my mum. How does she know? I asked. How does she know when to add things? How does she know when it's done? Practice. Mum said. Years and years of practice. She paused. Also, I think she hums. Have you tried humming? Mum. I'm serious. She always hums when she's cooking. Something about it slows her down, keeps her present. You should try it. I did try it, on Thursday, while attempting a simpler stew. I hummed. Tunelessly, self-consciously. And to my surprise, something shifted. I stopped rushing. I stopped looking at the clock on the microwave every 90 seconds. I started, tentatively, to smell things. The onions. The stock. The moment when the wine I'd added stopped smelling boozy and started smelling savory. I'd never noticed that before. I'd never been slow enough to notice it. The stew on Thursday wasn't perfect. The vegetables were slightly too soft and I'd been heavy-handed with the pepper. But it tasted like something. It tasted like I'd made it, not assembled it from instructions. Friday, I rang my cousin Sophie, who was the only other person in the family who'd ever seriously attempted to replicate the casserole. Don't bother, she said cheerfully. I tried 4 times. Once it caught fire. Not the food, the actual hob. And once Nana tasted it and said it was an interesting interpretation, in a tone that made me want to lie down on the floor. That's not helpful, Sophie. I know. What I'm saying is, go in with low expectations. What I found helps is not thinking about whether you're doing it right. Just cook. Like you're cooking for yourself, not for a test. But it is a test. Yes, but she'll be able to tell if you're scared. She can always tell. She's like a heat-seeking missile for anxiety in the kitchen. I spent Friday evening doing what I can only describe as meditation, though I'd be mortified to admit that to anyone. I sat in my kitchen. Not cooking, just sitting. And tried to think about what I actually knew. About food. About taste. About what made something feel like comfort rather than just sustenance. Nana's casserole wasn't just the ingredients. I knew that. I'd eaten it my entire life, and I knew, somewhere in my chest rather than my head, what it was supposed to feel like when you ate it. That heaviness that was somehow also lightness. The way the meat gave way. The richness of the sauce without being thick or cloying. The faint sweetness underneath everything that I'd never been able to identify. I went to bed on Friday feeling, for the first time that week, almost ready. Almost. Chapter 3. The Saturday Reckoning. I arrived at Nana's at 9 in the morning, which she'd specified, and which she clearly considered a soft start because she was already dressed. The kitchen was already warm, and she had laid out the ingredients on the counter, with the air of someone who had been waiting patiently for at least an hour. "Phone," she said, holding out her hand. I wasn't going to. "Phone." I handed it over. She put it on the Welsh dresser beside a ceramic rooster that had lived there since before I was born, face down, with the firmness of someone confiscating a weapon. "Right," she said. "The kitchen is yours. I'll be in the sitting room. Come and get me if there's a fire." "Just come and get you. You're not going to watch." "If I watch, you'll cook for me. I want you to cook for yourself." She paused at the kitchen door. "The stock is in the big pot on the right. The herbs are in the garden. I've left the scissors on the back step. The lamb is in the fridge. Everything else you'll find." She looked at me steadily. "You know more than you think you do." And then she left me alone in her kitchen. For a full minute, I just stood there. The kitchen smelled of old wood and dried lavender and something faintly meaty from the stock. Through the window I could see the garden. The herbs in untidy clumps along the wall, some leggy rosemary and thick-leafed sage and a thyme plant that had clearly been through some things. A robin was sitting on the fence post doing absolutely nothing useful. "Right," I said aloud, to no one. "Right then." I started with the lamb. A shoulder, just like I'd practiced. I trimmed it badly. Nana would absolutely clock that later. And seasoned it with salt and a reasonable amount of black pepper. I put the big cast iron pot on the hob and waited for it to warm up. This was the part where I usually pulled out my phone to check the temperature guidance. Without it, I hovered my hand over the surface, the way I'd watched Nana do it, until I felt the heat rising. I added a knob of butter. The good butter, the one in the blue wrapper. And watched it melt. "Happy pan," I muttered, and I actually smiled. The lamb went in and the sizzle was immediate and satisfying. A full-body sizzle, not a tentative one. I left it alone, which was genuinely difficult. My instinct was to move it, to check it, to lift a corner and see what was happening underneath. I resisted. I stood back and listened to it cook, and eventually, when the smell changed from raw to something closer to roasted, I turned it. The underside was a deep, even brown. Better than anything I'd managed all week. The onions were next. I found myself doing what Nana had said. I smelled them before I decided anything. They were sweet and fresh. Caramelize, something told me, not just soften. I sliced them thickly, the way Nana did, and put them in the pot with more butter and a pinch of sugar I almost didn't add but decided to trust. I hummed. Quietly, tunelessly, the sort of hum that has no particular song in it. Just sound to fill the room and slow me down. The garlic went in. 4 cloves, which felt like a lot. But I remembered now the deep, mellow quality of the casserole's base, and 4 felt right. Then the carrots and parsnips, which I'd cut in large uneven pieces because Nana's were always large and uneven. Vegetables didn't need to be perfect. They needed to cook. The herbs were the moment I'd been most anxious about, but the garden sorted me out. I walked out into the cool morning. The robin gave me a hard stare. And stood among the thyme and rosemary and just smelled them. Rosemary and thyme, definitely. A few sage leaves, which felt bold but right. I took a small bunch of each and went back inside. The wine was a Burgundy I'd found in Nana's pantry. Not expensive, but decent. I poured it in and did the thing I'd discovered on Thursday. I waited until the smell changed. The sharp alcoholic note softened and mellowed and became something else entirely. That was the moment. I added the stock then, ladled in from the pot on the right, watching the color deepen from pale to a rich reddish brown. Then the ingredients I'd been puzzling over all week. The unlabeled jars. There were 6 of them on the shelf above the stove. I opened each one and smelled it. Most I recognized. Smoked paprika, a dried mushroom powder, something that was probably celery salt. But one jar held a dark, almost black substance that smelled sweet and sharp at once. I stared at it. I smelled it again. Something in my memory stirred. Christmas, I thought suddenly. Or no. Something before Christmas. Something older. The smell of Grandpa Roy's coat coming in from the cold. The smell of something on the back of the hob on Sunday afternoons. Treacle. Dark, bitter, cooking treacle, just a small spoonful of it, tucked in at the end. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. I added half a teaspoon, stirred it in slowly, and watched the sauce darken. Everything went into the big pot then, the lid on, into the oven at a temperature I set by feel. Lower than felt instinctive, lower and slower. And I sat down at the pine table to wait. And I waited. Without my phone. Without a podcast or a scroll through something. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, and I listened to the sound of the oven, and smelled the air change as the casserole cooked, and occasionally I stood up and checked it the way she checked it. Lifting the lid to see if the liquid needed adjusting, tasting and adding a pinch of salt here, a little more of the mushroom powder there. 3 hours later, I opened the oven and I knew before I tasted it. I knew from the smell. From the color. From the way the meat had pulled away from itself. Something settled in my chest that I didn't have a name for. Not quite pride, not quite relief, but some mixture of the two with something warmer underneath. I called Nana in. Chapter 4. The tasting. She took her time about it, which was, I was beginning to realize, one of the things Nana Edith did deliberately. She came into the kitchen, looked at the pot on the stove, looked at me standing beside it, and then went to the cupboard to get a bowl and a spoon without comment. She ladled out a portion. She sniffed it. She sat down at the table. The silence stretched out long enough that I considered leaving the country. She tasted it. A small spoonful, like someone in a cooking competition. Eyes closed, head tilted slightly, face perfectly unreadable. Then another taste. Then she set the spoon down and looked at the bowl for a moment. "Well," she said. "Well? Sit down. You're making the room anxious." I sat down. She ate another spoonful. I tried to read her expression and failed completely. Nana Edith had a poker face that professional gamblers would have paid serious money to study. She'd once sat through an entire game of Trivial Pursuit, without revealing by so much as an eyebrow twitch whether she knew the answer to a question about the migratory patterns of Arctic terns, and had then swept every last piece off the board on her final turn. "The lamb," she said eventually, "is nicely done. The onions are right. You were heavy on the rosemary." She paused. "Not wrong, just heavy." I said nothing. I'd learned, somewhere around Thursday, to stop filling Nana's pauses. "The vegetables are too big. Another spoonful. Though that's how I do it, so that's my fault for not telling you." She looked up. "You found the treacle?" "Yes." "How?" I tried to explain it. The smell of the jar. The memory of Sunday afternoons, Grandpa Roy's coat. I sounded ridiculous as I said it. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. He used to make a black treacle toffee, she said, and her voice was different. Softer, turned inward. Every November. Bonfire night. He'd stand at that very stove and stir it for an hour. The whole house smelled of it. She looked at the pot. I've put treacle in this casserole for 40 years. I never told anyone. I always wondered if anyone would ever smell it and know. We sat with that for a moment. Nana, I said carefully, is that the secret ingredient? She snorted. No. Then what? The secret ingredient, she said, picking up her spoon again, is time. And attention. You can't shortcut either one. She ate a little more. Your app would have told you to cook this for 2 hours. You did it for 3. Why? It didn't smell right at 2 hours. So I left it. She nodded, slowly, as if I'd said something more significant than I'd intended. That's it. That's the whole of it, right there. The recipe is just a map. You still have to look out the window. She finished the bowl. She put the spoon down with a decisive click. Right. She said, standing up. Get me a pen. I blinked. Now. Unless you want to do this again next Saturday. No. No, I'll get a pen. I scrabbled in the kitchen drawer. The one that holds the things that no kitchen drawer should hold. Including a broken thermometer, several receipts from 2009, and a keyring shaped like a Welsh dragon whose origins no one could explain. And produced a functional biro and a notepad with a partially completed crossword on the first page. Nana turned to a fresh page and wrote for nearly 20 minutes. I didn't speak. I watched her handwriting. Precise and slightly old-fashioned, with looped letters and well-spaced lines. Cover 2 full pages. She noted not just quantities but temperatures and times described not in numbers but in sensory terms. Cook until the onions look almost embarrassed. And the wine should stop smelling like wine before you add the stock. And the meat is ready when it stops arguing with the fork. At the bottom, she wrote. The treacle is for Roy. She handed me the pages. I read them through. I looked up at her. Thank you, I said. Don't lose it, she said. And don't put it in one of those cloud things. Keep it somewhere real. I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. I will. Now sit down, she said, going to the cupboard for a second bowl. I'm having another portion and you should have some too. It would be a waste to let it sit there being admired. Chapter 5. The dinner party. And what it was really for. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening, I stood in my own kitchen in Leeds. Smaller than Nana's, with a hob that ran slightly hot on the left burner. And made the casserole for the first time alone. My phone was in the sitting room. I'd put it there deliberately, face down on the coffee table next to a coaster, well out of reach. The recipe pages were propped against the kettle in Nana's handwriting, and I glanced at them occasionally, but found, to my surprise, that I didn't need to very often. Some of it had moved from my head to somewhere else. Somewhere more physical. My hands knew when the butter was ready. My nose told me when the wine had changed. My eyes watched the color of the onions and knew, with a certainty I couldn't entirely explain, when they had become what they needed to be. I hummed. Some shapeless tune that wasn't any song in particular. Marcus knocked on the wall at one point and I knocked back, which was now our established system for communicating that everything was fine. The treacle went in last, half a teaspoon, stirred slowly into the sauce. I thought of bonfire night. I thought of a man only half known, standing at a stove in Yorkshire stirring toffee for an hour because November deserved it. I thought of the way certain smells carry things in them that words can't quite reach. Not information exactly, but presence. The casserole went into the oven. I set an actual timer. Not an app, just the oven timer. And then ignored it in favor of checking by instinct. The timer was just a safety net now, not a master. My friends arrived at 7:30. There were 6 of them. My friend Priya and her partner Jonah. My colleague Dan, who had been deeply skeptical when I told him what I was cooking. My university friend Caitlin, who would eat anything enthusiastically and reliably. And my neighbor Marcus, who I'd invited partly out of guilt for the smoke alarm incident, and partly because he was excellent company. I didn't make a big deal of the food. That felt wrong, somehow. Like bragging about something that wasn't really mine to brag about. I put the pot on the table and let people serve themselves, and poured wine and got out the bread I'd made that morning. A simple loaf that had taken 3 attempts over the preceding week and was now reliably good. The first person to react was Caitlin, who stopped mid-sentence in a conversation about something else, looked down at her bowl, and said, Oh, this is really something." Dan, who had been skeptical, was quiet for a worryingly long time. Then he said, "Did you make this from scratch?" "Yes." "Like, from actual scratch? Not a slow cooker thing, not a kit, from actual scratch?" He looked at his bowl, then at me, with the expression of a man reassessing several assumptions simultaneously. "I didn't know you could cook." "I couldn't, really," I said. "I'm learning." The evening went well in the way that evenings go well when the food is right. Conversation easier, pauses more comfortable, the table feeling like a place people want to stay rather than leave. After dinner, when the pot was empty and the wine was nearly done, Priya asked where the recipe was from. "My grandmother," I said. "She taught me." "Could I get the recipe?" I thought about that for a moment. The folded pages in my kitchen drawer. I'd put them there the first day, in a small plastic wallet, exactly as instructed. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe you should come round and I'll cook it for you. And you can see how it's made." Priya laughed. "Very mysterious." "My grandmother is mysterious. I'm just trying to keep up." I rang Nana the next morning. It was early. She's always up before 8. And she picked up on the second ring. "Well?" she said. No preamble. "It went well. Everyone liked it." "Of course they liked it." "Did you use the good butter?" "Yes." "And you didn't rush it?" "I did it for 3 hours and 20 minutes. A pause. Then, with enormous dignity, "That's the correct amount of time." "Nana," I said, "why did it have to be this way? Why couldn't you just give me the recipe 3 weeks ago and let me follow it?" She was quiet for a moment. I could hear the sound of her kitchen in the background. The particular acoustic of that space. Stone floor and low ceiling and the distant sigh of the old boiler. "Because a recipe," she said, "is only as good as the person reading it. If I'd just handed you those pages 3 weeks ago, you'd have followed them like a set of instructions. You'd have had the right ingredients in the right order and it would have been." She paused. "Adequate." "Adequate," I repeated. "But you'd have been watching the clock. Waiting to be told what to do. You wouldn't have been cooking, you'd have been executing." Another pause. "Your grandfather used to say, a good recipe tells you what to make. A good cook already knows." I stood at my kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the grey Leeds morning, at the pigeons on the rooftop opposite doing their pigeon things. Did he really say that? Probably not. He mostly said, "Is it ready yet?" But the sentiment is right. I could hear the smile in her voice. "Same time next month? I thought we could do the pie." I looked at my kitchen. The pot on the stove, still faintly warm. The recipe pages in their plastic wallet. The herbs I'd bought and not yet killed. "Yes," I said. But I'm keeping my phone this time. You are absolutely not keeping your phone. Worth a try. Cheeky, she said, and hung up. I put my phone in my pocket. Where it belonged, I supposed, not in my hand. And made myself a cup of tea and stood in my kitchen for a while, not really doing anything in particular, just being in the room. It was, I was starting to understand, part of the process. Outside, it had started to rain. The pigeons didn't mind. And somewhere in Yorkshire, in a kitchen that smelled of lavender and old wood and something always gently simmering, my grandmother was probably already thinking about next month's lesson. And absolutely, definitely not telling anyone what it was going to be.